Hello and welcome to the Fetal Position, episode number 4. Today we're going to be discussing how we can re-humanize the unborn. One of my goals when I first started this podcast was to sort of lay a few foundational episodes down so that when I proceed to talk about other topics in the future, that the episodes that I started off with were the ones that laid the foundation that allowed me to approach the other topics having already laid a pro-life foundation. Now, I think I've done that, and so now that those foundational episodes are out of the way, I wanted to kind of get into maybe some current events, but the bulk of the episodes are always going to be evergreen. Evergreen is a marketing term for something that does not lose its value once the event has gone away. So if I were to talk about, let's say, Bernie Sanders' position on abortion, that would be a very non-evergreen topic. But if I were to talk about Democrats and their approach to abortion in general, that would be a little more evergreen. And then if I were to talk about bodily rights arguments, that's a very evergreen content. So for the most part still, I'm going to try to keep the episodes short, so I won't dwell too long on the current events. But if you are interested in current events and other things like that, you can follow the Fetal Position at fetal_position, the Twitter account, or go to the Fetal Position Facebook page, which is thefetalposition.com/Facebook. There have been a few people that have been posting in the Facebook page that are bringing up some really interesting ideas and bringing up some interesting things that are kind of going on in the culture. One of which is there's a libertarian candidate right now. His name is Austin Peterson. He's running for the libertarian, the nomination, and he posted something. It was a live stream Facebook video, and it was called "Can You Be a Pro-Life Atheist?" If you go to, I'll put this in the show notes too, but if you go to the Fetal Position Facebook page, you can see it there. And one of the things that inspired me to do is I want to get a bunch of people from a bunch of different perspectives that are all pro-life, because we have pro-life people in virtually every category of metaphysical background or any political background, things like that. I have friends who are Democrats who are pro-life. I have friends who are libertarians who are pro-life. I'm actually a libertarian who is also pro-life. So I might be doing an episode in the future on how the libertarian principles justify pro-life things. How an atheist can be pro-life. I don't know of any Muslims who are pro-life yet, but that's just because I don't have a ton of contact with the Muslim community. So if you guys have anybody that you know that would have an interesting or a unique perspective being both pro-life and something else, like whether he's a Christian or a Muslim or a Jew or any other perspective, I want to get as much of that as I can in here to have like interviews and things like that, because my goal is not to just have me talking to you, although I could probably do that for probably a couple hundred episodes, but I do want to get another voice in here, at least in a few different perspectives. For me, I can do the Christian perspective and I can do the libertarian perspective, but I may even grab somebody from those perspectives to be able to see if they can come on the show and talk about how their libertarian leanings or their Christian leanings can lend them, make it so that being pro-life is the most reasonable perspective. One current event that I wanted to touch on in this episode was something it's in the area of science and of fertilization, and I'm reading from the Telegraph. I'll put a link in the show notes. And the title of the article is "Bright Flash of Light Marks Incredible Moment Life Begins When Sperm Meets Egg." And then from the article itself, "Human life begins in bright flash of light as a sperm meets an egg, scientists have shown for the first time after capturing the astonishing quote-unquote fireworks on film. An explosion of tiny sparks erupt from the egg at the exact moment of conception. Scientists have seen the phenomenon occur in other animals, but it's the first time that it has also been shown to happen in humans." So this is super cool because there's a lot of people who, on the pro-choice end of things, who will point to human development and say, we don't know when human life begins. Now, we've known this for quite some time, but this is a brand new thing that allows us to say, no, it's not only do we already know that it begins at conception, but we have this clear evidence of it starting right at conception. And I'll get into some of the science as to why that actually is the case. When I was doing my undergrad, I was in a genetics course, and we got this textbook. It's called Human Genetics by Ricky Lewis. I'm reading right now from the 9th edition, which is from 2008, in a section under fertilization. It's got some kind of what do you call it, jargon, but I'll review for those of you guys who are not as familiar with biological terminology. So it says here, a sperm first contacts a covering of follicle cells called the corona radiata that guards the secondary oocyte. Oocyte is an egg. The sperm's acrosome then bursts, releasing enzymes that bore through a protective layer of the glycoprotein beneath the corona radiata. Fertilization, or conception, begins when the outer membranes of the sperm and secondary oocyte meet. The encounter is dramatic. A wave of electricity spreads physical and chemical changes across the entire oocyte surface, changes that keep the other sperm out. All right, so to summarize that, we have a sperm cell and an egg cell. In the process of fertilization, the sperm cell, all it has to do is just break through the membrane on the outside of the egg, and then that's when the beginning of conception happens. As soon as that happens, the proteins in the sperm cell actually interact with the proteins in the egg cell, and that causes a chemical and physical change that puts up pretty much a barrier so that no other sperm can actually get in, or very few other sperm can get in. It is possible, actually, the book here says that it's possible for other sperm to get in. More than one sperm can enter an oocyte, but the resulting cell has too much genetic material for development to follow. So the goal is basically for the egg cell to prevent any additional sperm cells from getting in, because if it does, then it doesn't develop. But the goal is to have one sperm and one egg combined together to make one brand new human being. This new development in where you see the sparks of fertilization, it goes more into the evidence showing that this is actually the case. Now, we've known this for a while, as I think I was saying earlier, because we've seen this in other mammals, but this is the first time that we've seen it in human beings. Now, I think it's important to point out here that what the scientists were doing here were not actually combining a sperm and an egg cell. Towards the end of the article has this statement. It says, in the experiment, scientists use a sperm enzyme rather than actual sperm to show what happens at the moment of conception. So it's a particular enzyme that causes the zinc spark. They weren't using the actual sperm cell because that would be creating a new human being, probably in an attempt just to show that this is here, and then they're just going to dispose of the new human being, which is not something I would be in favor of. However, the article does go on to talk about why this is important and how it can be used for things like in vitro fertilization. I would like to do an episode or two or three, probably a handful of episodes on in vitro fertilization, maybe talking about the science and the things that are problematic with it. But for the moment, in vitro fertilization is just an artificial combination of sperm and egg cell. So in this article, it talks about, I'll just quote it. It says, this means that if you can look at the zinc spark at the time of fertilization, you will know immediately which eggs are the good ones to transfer in vitro fertilization. It's a way of sorting egg quality in a way we've never been able to assess before. All of biology starts at the time of fertilization, yet we know next to nothing about the events that occur in the human. So while this is really cool evidence of the origin of human life right at conception, it seems as though what the goal, at least partially the goal of this research, is to discover which newly fertilized eggs or new embryos are good for in vitro fertilization. So if what they're going to be doing is activating a bunch of eggs by putting sperm in there, they're going to be creating a bunch of new human beings. Because what I talked about earlier, when that sperm enzyme interacts with the the egg enzyme, it closes it off to any and all other sperm. So they can't do this test beforehand. They can't just, send a sperm enzyme in there and then look at the zinc sparks and think, okay, this one's really great. These 4 are awesome. Let's actually put the DNA in here. That it doesn't work like that because the egg immediately puts up that wall. But what they are now doing is essentially using this zinc spark once the sperm has entered into the egg, and whichever one is the brightest, they say, okay, this is the most viable. And then from that point, they will likely just dispose of the other ones, which is problematic, as you can imagine. So what we have here is really awesome evidence of the exact moment of conception. At least this is, from what I can tell, this is the moment where the egg cell prevents the entrance of another sperm cell. I could be wrong on that, but based on what I've read and what I've learned, I don't think I am. So we have that new development in science, but we also have this other thing where ethically we shouldn't just be creating human organisms. We shouldn't be creating 200 eggs, recording the zinc sparks on all of them, and then using the best zinc spark to implant it into a woman, and then toss out the rest of 199 newly created human organisms. To quote, I don't even know who it is. Hang on, let's look it up on Goodreads. So it's a quote that is, just because we can doesn't mean that we should. Goodreads says that it is from the prolific penman, which I think is another word, another pseudonym for anonymous. But he says, just because we can doesn't mean we should, and just because we should doesn't mean we can. So this is a part of scientific advancement that we have to make sure is properly informed by an appropriate view of the human being. We can't just do these things without thinking through the consequences of them logically and ethically. Now, it may be that the human being is not valuable until a certain point, but that has to be argued for. It can't be just assumed to be the case so that we can do more development in our scientific studies. We have to understand what we're dealing with before we start dealing with it. Now, just to jump back, because I don't want to make it seem like I'm giving you incorrect information, you know how typically with new scientific advancements, the popular press or the media will jump on board and make a big deal out of it without really understanding all the ins and outs. Well, this particular article and series of articles that you can probably find all over the place are no different. Now, it is true that the scientists did see a zinc spark, but I want to make sure, as a commenter on an article that's on Secular Pro-Life, he says that there is no miraculous flash of light happening in bedrooms all across the world. This is true. This particular zinc spark was activated by fluorescence microscopy, and they did a lot of things to be able to make sure they could see the zinc spark, the quote unquote zinc spark, before they activated it with the enzymes. So yeah, there's no angels singing or whatever with this bright flash of light. That's not how this works. The spark of light can only be seen in a particular environment and under particular conditions. So yeah, just to kind of take a dump on the awesomeness of a zinc spark making flashes of lights in the uterus all across the world. That's not how this works. It's much more boring than that, unfortunately. It is still pretty cool, though. I mean, that this thing has been seen. It's still pretty awesome. It's just, I guess you gotta get clicks somehow, right? Sell papers, if people even did that anymore. So yeah, anything that is related to that, I'll put in the show notes under a headline, the zinc spark or something like that. It'll be relatively easy to figure out. It will be thefetalposition.com/4. I did have a very small conversation with Jeremy Lundmark on the Theology Mixer Radio. We talked very briefly. This is before I launched this show. We were talking about a whole bunch of things, and one of the things that we talked about was in vitro fertilization. We talked very briefly about that, and there's a lot more detail that I could go into, but I'll also put a link in the show notes in case you are interested in checking that out as well. Another current event that I want to talk about is an article I'm reading on the Daily Dot right now. I'll put, again, a link in the show notes. The article here says, Oklahoma House passes bill banning all abortions. When I first read that, I was like, what? This is totally out of left field. I would not expect this at all. But it seems to be the case. So I'm going to go ahead and read from the article here. It says, late on Thursday, the Oklahoma House of Representatives passed a bill that fully bans abortion in the state. Oklahoma's SB 1552 passed by a 59-9 vote on the heavily Republican legislature. The law is now on the desk of the state Republican's governor, Mary Fallin, who has yet to address whether she plans to sign the legislation into law. If she does, the state could face one of the most intense federal legal battles on the issue. They're attempting to ban all abortions. It just has to be signed into law by Mary Fallin, the governor. When I read here a little bit later, it says the controversial Oklahoma bill manages to sideline abortion services by revoking the medical license of any doctor found performing the procedure for any other reason than in cases of miscarriage or severe physical trauma to the fetus or pregnant woman. My first initial thought was, wait a sec, what about if we're talking about saving the life of the woman, like in an ectopic pregnancy? But the text of the SB 1552 says, performance of an abortion as defined by Section 1730 of Title 63 of the Oklahoma statutes with an intention other than to increase the probability of a live birth, to preserve the life or health of the child after birth, or to remove an ectopic pregnancy, or to remove a dead unborn child who has died as a result of a spontaneous miscarriage, accidental trauma, or criminal assault on the pregnant female or her unborn child. So basically, this will allow virtually any operation to happen if the woman's life is in danger, like an ectopic pregnancy, which is when the egg implants in the fallopian tube, and the baby's going to die either way. So I'd rather have saving two lives or saving one life and aborting one that's inevitably going to die rather than just waiting that one out and causing two deaths, right? So then there's also the having a spontaneous miscarriage that, the miscarriage happens, the baby dies, but the baby's still left inside of the woman, and so this allows for that type of protection when it comes to doctors being able to perform the surgeries if it's medically necessary. Now, this is pretty much a big middle finger to the federal the constitutional, as of right now, the constitutionally protected right in Roe versus Wade for a woman to have an abortion. But to be honest, I don't know how this is going to end up. It's going to be very interesting because there are a very significant number of people in the political philosophy field who don't believe that a federal law requires the state to do anything. I'm going to see if I can find this. I was listening to a podcast. Because I'm a libertarian, I listen to libertarian podcasts, and one of my favorite is the Jason Stapleton program. And he was interviewing someone who is I forget her name. She's a constitutional expert. Hang on, I'm going to pause the podcast and find her name. All right, got it. Her name is Chris Ann Hall. She's a constitutional expert, and she essentially, in a conversation between her and Jason, he pretty much just said that the state is allowed to say, thanks, federal government, for your opinion, but we're not going to do that. And I am not going to even come close to pretending that I am a constitutional expert. Nowhere even near. I've read some of it, but I'm gonna see if I can find the link to that show, because for those of you guys who are interested in the constitutional rights that a state has based compared to what the federal government can do, it was a very, very interesting discussion. So I'm looking forward to hearing and reading more about how this is going to end up, because it's well, it is just very interesting. And the last little thing is a little bit more personal. So as I mentioned in episode 1, I am a father of an almost 2-year-old son and an unborn child. I'd like to tell you a little bit more about the development of Cole. That's his name. He's Cole. And I want to tell you a little bit more about it because fetal development is just really cool. So I would kind of wish I would have started earlier, but hey, might as well start now. My wife is currently 32 weeks pregnant, and if you jump over to certain websites have a developmental, they'll tell you how far along babies are when they're developing. And so the one I'm reading right now is babycenter.com, and on the top it says that your baby's developing fingernails. And I just remember in the movie Juno, they had, if you haven't seen it, you should see that movie. But in the movie Juno, the main character goes, and she was kind of exploring the option of having an abortion, and one of her friends is standing outside of the abortion clinic, and she says, she shouts to her, or she tells her that her baby has fingernails, and she's totally caught off guard by that. She's like, fingernails? Really? And it just goes to show you that you can have as much science as you want, but it's not really going to sound convincing to anybody who's not willing to listen to it. But if you have just someone who's willing to understand that your baby has fingernails, it's cool. But you can. That's what I mean, is that you have to know who you're talking to when you're talking about this topic. So from Baby Center, by now the baby weighs 3 3/4 pounds, is about the size of a large jicama. I didn't know what a jicama was, so I googled it. And a jicama is a Mexican yam bean or a Mexican turnip. I've never seen it before in my life, but it's about the size of a coconut. I think that's the next size up. And so Cole is about 16.7 inches long, taking up a lot of space in my wife's uterus. The article continues about as if the article is talking to a pregnant woman, so I'm just going to read it instead of having to translate it. It says, "You're gaining about a pound a week, and roughly half of that goes right to your baby. She'll gain a third to half of her birth weight during the next 7 weeks as she fattens up for survival outside the womb. She now has toenails, fingernails, and real hair, at least respectable peach fuzz. Her skin is becoming soft and smooth as she plumps up in preparation for birth." Like I said, I kind of wish I would have started this earlier, but I really like the whole the science and seeing what's actually going on during fetal development. But I don't want to leave Micah out. Micah's my oldest. I don't want to leave him out because he might listen to this podcast, 8-9 years from the future and think, hey, why do you only talk about Cole? So I recorded him the other day. He has recently learned how to count and say his alphabet. And I'll put it at the end of this end of the show after the music is over, and you can. So if you care about that, you can listen to it afterwards. He gets, I'm not really entirely sure, but he gets the hummingbird and an ambulance confused. So you'll hear me. I think we get to like JIKLMNO or somewhere around there, and he starts to kind of get distracted, and then I say, "Micah, what does a hummingbird say?" And you'll have to. Oh, this is like clickbait. You'll have to listen to the end of the episode to be able to hear. You'll never believe what happens next. What? Elijah asks his son what a hummingbird says. You'll never believe what happens next. So yeah, if you're interested in that, it's going to be at the end of the episode. Okay, now that I have all that stuff out of the way, I hope you enjoyed that. That was, it's going to be, I think I want to do that depending on the feedback I get from this episode, because like I was saying at the beginning of the episode, I want to have something that isn't necessarily evergreen, but then get into an evergreen content. So if you like that, let me know. If you didn't, let me know. Maybe you liked it all, except for me explaining how far along developed my unborn son is. But hey, you know what? If you didn't like that, I guess if I get a lot of pushback, maybe I'll stop that. But no, he's at 32 weeks. We only have like 8 weeks left, so you'll be fine. Anyway, now I'm going to jump into the the actual primary content of this, which is humanizing the unborn or rehumanizing the unborn. A little while back, I was listening to some music while playing with Micah, and the music I decided to put on was some kind of like instrumental stuff. It's a band called Maserati. I really like Maserati, and every album that they put out is just it's better than the previous one. It's just fantastic. The most recent one, there's a song on there called "Re-humanizer," and I really liked the song, and so I took a look at what the name of the song was as I was listening to it, and it was called "Rehumanizer," and I was like, "This is great! That's a really awesome way to." Now I have inspiration for another episode of the Fetal Position. So this is an inspiration from Maserati. Now, it's kind of like an introductory paragraph. I have to make sure that we know that the reason that we are referring to the unborn is that we have to. You can't really talk about that which is being killed in a conversation about abortion unless we refer to the unborn child as something. Now, there are some people who will assume their own position on the topic, and you know the type. You'll always have the pro-lifer who will say, you want to murder babies, and then you have the pro-choicer who will say, no, we're just removing the parasite. I don't want to say parasite because not everybody says that, but they'll say something like, you're just removing the embryo or removing the fetus, or they'll say something even more clinical and dehumanizing, like you're removing the blastocyst or the pharyngula or something like that. But the key here is to recognize that any label that we give it will potentially have some kind of connotation. And that's what I kind of want to explore in the next couple minutes. Now, right off the bat, I want to make it clear that when we talk about a embryo, a blastocyst, a pharyngula, a fetus, a newborn, a toddler, a teenager, an adult, all of these are just different labels that we give to the development of a human being. So, in a strict technical sense, calling the unborn child a fetus is not dehumanizing in and of itself, but the way that the term is being used, if it's being used instead of something a little bit more accurate or something like that, then you can kind of tell where the person is going with what they're assuming in the conversation. Now, the reason I want to talk about this is because it's important for us to, not only in a conversation with other people, but with the way that we think about it, it's important for us to see the human being appropriately, see the unborn human being as what he or she is, as an unborn human being. I was having a conversation with somebody probably a few weeks ago, and they were referring to the child as a fetus. Now, there's nothing, like I was saying, there's nothing inherently wrong with this, but the way that she was saying it was like with, I think I was listening to an episode of Life Report, and he said that the person that he was talking to referred to fetus with stank on it, like, ew, gross, fetus, just a whatever, a non-valuable human being, and that's the point. Is if they are using the word fetus to refer to a human being that has no value, or even worse, a non-human entity, then they're essentially philosophically incorrect. Well, if they're referring to it as a non-human being, then they're wrong scientifically. But if they're referring to the fetus as a fetus specifically because they want to rid any value from the human organism that they're referring to, then we have an issue, because that's the whole thing that's in contention, right? We have to make sure that we are arguing for our positions and not just accepting them as true and then using that definition or using that understanding in the conversation. For the most part, when I'm in a conversation about an abortion, I will use the term unborn human being, or unborn human. And this is because it assumes the factual nature of the science that exists. There are a few people that I've heard that will attempt to not use even human. And to be honest, I'm not entirely sure why, because what this does, and this is a kind of tactical, if you say unborn human, then depending on who the person is, they'll either agree with it, that it's an unborn human being, right? So then great, then you can talk about philosophy because the science is out of the way. But if if the person you're talking to denies that the unborn child is a human, then you have to get that out of the way, because there's no way. Well, I guess it's logically possible, but I've never had an experience where somebody would deny the humanity of the unborn while simultaneously giving the unborn personhood. That just, I mean, again, like I said, I think in the first episode, I don't want to get into what makes a non-human person, but purely in the context of the abortion debate, it is, I'm just going to say very rare, but I'm going to say next to impossible, that somebody would give the unborn human personhood without ascribing to him or her humanity. So I make no apologies when I assume that the unborn human being is an unborn human being, because that's what the 100% scientific consensus says about it. And when I do say this, it's specifically so that I can push the conversation towards what the real issue is. Because if they're denying that it's a human being, we got to talk about the science. But if they're denying that it's a human being with rights, then we're talking about personhood, and that's philosophy. So saying this allows me to jump right into the important aspect of the conversation, which is, what is the unborn? In a different conversation I was having with somebody, the guy just absolutely refused to refer to the unborn human being as anything other than a fetus. And so I was like, okay, fine, whatever. As long as you recognize that the unborn human being, or sorry, the fetus is human, then we can move on. And he's like, okay, fine, that works. And I'm like, okay, whatever. He just wants to debate semantics. So I was like, I'm out. Let's talk about something more valuable than just debating whether or not we should or should not call the unborn human being a fetus. I found out after a couple more minutes of conversation that he was just using the word fetus because he did not see the unborn human being as valuable. So fetus to him was the way to refer to a non-valuable unborn human being, because he was uncomfortable with abortion's past viability, because that would actually cause, you had to actively kill something that was going to stay alive if you take it out of the womb. But with the non-valuable, he attached value to viability, which is, of course, a level of development argument. And you can listen back to episode 1. I'm obviously going to get more into the level of development, viability specifically, in further episodes, but I did talk very briefly about it in episode 1. So his position was that value was bestowed upon the human organism at viability. And any time before viability, he just called that a fetus, is essentially synonymous with non-valuable human being or human organism. But that's actually, if we're going to be, and again, pedantic or be a little bit obsessive with semantics, what if we are talking about before the fetal stage? Because like in humans, the fetal stage begins at week 9. So what are we to refer to an 8-week-old developing human organism? What is that? He would have probably just called it a fetus, but technically it is not a fetus. This is why I made that point earlier about when we call something a fetus or an embryo or a newborn or whatever. This is all just labels that we give to certain stages of development of a human organism. The stage right before the fetal stage is the embryonic stage. Now, if you look at, there's the Wikipedia article on prenatal development, I'll post that in the show notes, and it talks about the reason that we delineate between embryo and fetal is because during the fetal period, all major structures are already formed in the fetus, but they continue to grow and develop. So, like anything else, there's just a certain amount of development that we we refer to as a fetus. Anything before that is an embryo, or to get even more pedantic, there's like blastocysts and frangulas and things like that. But the fetus is just yet another stage in human development. But so as someone who is against abortion, if I want to say that I'm against abortion from conception until birth, now what term can I use for that, given that the development of the human being in the womb is separated into at least two categories, embryo and fetus? What can I call the organism that proceeds from the embryo stage to the fetal stage? What is that thing? And that's what I like to call an unborn human, because that's I think that seems like the most neutral way to talk about it. So if we just take a look at abortion statistics, upwards of about 90% of all abortions in the U.S. are performed within the first trimester of pregnancy. So a pregnancy is 40 weeks, and if we divide 40 by 3, then we have 13 weeks. So the first trimester is first trimester goes into the second trimester at 13 weeks. The reason I bring that up is because that includes the fetal stage. So you can't even just really talk about trimesters either when we're talking about the abortion statistics or the development of the human organism. When I first wrote down my introduction to this episode, the part that I do when the music plays before the dubsteppy type thing pops in, my first initial way that I wanted to introduce this was, welcome to the Fetal Position, episode 4. Today we're going to be discussing, I didn't write it, actually, I deleted it to replace with a new one, but it was something along the lines of, we're going to be discussing how we can rehumanize our unborn brothers, sisters, sons, and daughters. Now, I was going to do that deliberately so that people could be like, well, that's an interesting way of looking at it, because if we phrase it like that, then it gives it more, for lack of a better term, it manipulates people emotionally. In the same way that if I were to say how to talk about the fetus and embryo, I know that these terms are neutral scientifically. They're all talking about development of the human organism, but they do have a sort of a distancing effect, a clinical effect, where the word fetus just becomes kind of a placeholder for something that is morally neutral. And to be honest, I don't want that to be the case. What we want to do is we want to use language in a way that conveys as much neutrality as possible, but we want it to also not, we don't want to make it so that we completely dehumanize the unborn. I'm not saying that it's totally useless to do that, because in some cases somebody may not even talk to you unless you refer to it as a fetus. Just say fetus. I don't want to hear anything about unborn human beings or whatever. I don't want you dare say babies. So be pragmatic, but for the most part, when you're talking to somebody, just use unborn human being. I like to use that. Maybe not being, maybe unborn human entity or unborn human works. I think I'm just gonna stick with that. And if you guys have an option or an alternative that you use, let me know, because unborn human has worked out well for me so far because of the way that it leads the conversation into the appropriate questions. Now, we're getting close to the end of what the notes that I have here. But I do have one thing that I really can't stand. It's when somebody refers to the embryo or the blastocyst as a fertilized egg. It doesn't make any sense. Scientifically speaking, it makes no sense to call something a fertilized egg, because once you have, especially in the case for like mammals, where we have once the egg is fertilized, you no longer have an egg. You no longer have a sperm cell. You have a brand new human organism, or a brand new mammalian organism. So when someone says fertilized egg, that's probably the only term that I hear that I will give pushback, because I'm like, dude, it makes no sense. You can't have all right. I don't need to go further into that. it doesn't make sense to say that there is a fertilized egg, because somebody will say that indignantly. They'll say, "Oh, I can't believe you want to sacrifice women's rights for a fertilized egg." And that's not what's happening. But yeah, okay. So use terminology correctly and carefully. After a little while, if you're not used to doing this, you will get used to doing this, where you just use the words that are appropriate based on the amount of conversations that you've had. And if, like I said earlier, if you guys have a different terminology that you use that you've found successful, let me know. I'll adopt your strategy. I had one person who was defending. Oh man, I can't even imagine this actually them really holding this position unless they're Peter Singer or somebody in his camp. But they were defending essentially infanticide, in that because their view was that the human being did not have value until it was able to think or has sentience of some kind. Now, the third trimester is the last trimester, because third trimester is 3 trimesters. But people will colloquially refer to the newborn stage, the first 3 months of life, or possibly the first month, maybe 2 months of life, as the 4th trimester, and that's because, I mean, if you've ever held a newborn, they're pretty much fetal. They can't really do much except just eat and breathe and poop and cry and sleep. That's all they can do. They don't focus on anything with their eyes. They don't really grasp anything. They don't seem to have any sort of cognitive capabilities other than very basic stuff. The reason I bring this up is because in a conversation I had with somebody he was using the term neonate instead of newborn. Neonate? Who even calls a newborn a neonate? What a weird thing to do. And the only thing I could think, I hate to assess motivations because I can't stand when people do that to me, but the only thing, I didn't bring this up, but the only thing that I could think of was that he was using the term neonate to distance himself emotionally or whatever from the fact that he was defending the woman's right or the parent's right to kill their newly born child. And I really wanted him to say child, that you have the right to kill your baby. I wanted him to say that, but he didn't. He deliberately avoided saying that because he was more comfortable, which I guess I can understand, being more comfortable with a term like a neonate than newborn baby. But this, again, is how our language can shape the way that we view things and give it, a dehumanizing effect. And the very last thing I want to say is, when I brought this up to somebody, they asked me if it was because I am just uncomfortable with terms like fetus and embryo, or neonate. I'm a little bit uncomfortable with neonate because it's weird. But other than like fetus and embryo, no, I'm fine with that. I'm not at all uncomfortable with these terms. It's just vitally important for us to know that we have a proper understanding of the type of entity that we are dealing with, and that entity is a human entity. And ultimately, if the goal is to move the conversation forward and have a productive dialogue, language is vitally important to take into account. So that concludes the topic that I wanted to talk about today. This is probably way longer than any of the other episodes that I put up. I guess we'll see how many current events I can cover in the beginning of each one of these episodes to make it so that it's staying below my 20-minute, 30-minute mark. My ultimate goal is to get it below 30 minutes, and I'm going to try to see if I can end this as quick as possible so that I can see if it managed to stay under 30 minutes. So, a quick wrap up is that you can find all the show notes on thefetalposition.com/4. You can find my Twitter page. You can find the Facebook page. You can find, I even have these episodes up on YouTube. You can share those if that makes it easier. If someone doesn't have a podcasting software, they just want to watch it on their YouTube account, they can do that. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me in any of the ways that are listed on the Fetal Position's just thefetalposition.com. I have all my contact information there. Thank you again, everybody who rated or reviewed the show. You are my new favorite people. And if you like the show, give me a rating and review. It really helps out. My goal was to get onto the iTunes new and noteworthy. I don't know if I'm going to be able to do that because I don't think I have a large enough audience base just yet. And by the time I get that, I'm not going to be quote unquote new and noteworthy yet or anymore. But yes, so thank you for reviewing it. Thank you for listening, and I will talk to you guys next time. B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, E-I-O. Yeah, E-I-O. What does a hummingbird say?